the concept of the 10 worlds. 10 worlds come from Nichiren Daishonin's explanation of Ichinen Sanzen, the theory propounded by Tiantai, or Tendai, in China, drawn from the Lotus Sutra. And the 10 worlds are not places, as sometimes is explained, where you are born into in another lifetime. For instance, living a certain way in this lifetime, being reborn into the world of hunger or hungry spirits, and that's like a place or another existence where a person would be trapped, or into the world of animality, where they would actually be born as an animal and live in that world. But rather, we view these 10 worlds as life states or conditions of life that a human being experiences all the time. They are hell, suffering physically or mentally, hunger, animality, anger, tranquility, rapture, learning, realization, bodhisattva, and Buddha. These 10 worlds are all something that we can experience. In the lower 9, we experience quite frequently. The lower 6 don't require any effort. So as you go through your day, according to your environment, always a stimulus from your environment, a person, a changing circumstance, you will find your life in one of these life states. And sometimes you'll change rapidly. If you wake up in the morning and you hear a large crash outside, and run outside and find out that your car has been smashed into, you may become upset. But then maybe you come back into the house and there's a delicious smell of someone preparing breakfast for you, and you feel wonderful, at peace, or in rapture. It'd be a better example if I reverse those two. And how quickly you can change from being happy to being angry to being curious about something to many different states we change. Rapture is the state of having a desire fulfilled or accomplished, but all these are very temporary. They're not anything you can hold on to as permanent happiness. Rapture being the highest of these, then making effort in terms of learning about life through your own effort, study, gaining things from the teachings of other people, realization, being self-reflection, learning about life from your own things. These are things that you find in students and people and contemplative people all the time. Their life condition is higher, happier than being in hell or hunger or something like that, but we still experience all of these. And then bodhisattva, an altruistic life condition or state of caring about, serving, and helping other people, is also something that you find naturally in people. In Nichiren Daishonin's teachings, Buddhahood, though, is a state that there isn't an external cause for without the practice of Buddhism. And this is why Buddha came into the world, and down through the centuries, the teachings of Shakyamuni, in particular the Lotus Sutra, then through, again, China and Tiantai's interpretations of it, and finally in Nichiren Daishonin's explanations of it, it made this essential teaching available to people by which they could activate their state of Buddhahood. And that this state of Buddhahood exists within you as certainly as hell does, certainly as rapture does, and all the other states of life. It's part of you. But the practice of Buddhism enables you to bring this out. And this is something that you don't have to believe in, you don't even have to understand. But Nichiren taught that it was such a direct cause of enlightenment that he was teaching the chanting of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, the title of the Lotus Sutra, and having faith in the fact that your life itself was no different than the life of the Buddha, that your life itself was no different than the life of the universe. And with this faith and this chant of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, you were able to activate this Buddha nature within you. So the idea is that as you're actually chanting, and members who are practicing this Buddhism do this every day in their home in the morning and the evening, as you're doing this, at that moment that you're chanting this, you are fully having activated the state of Buddhahood, which in many teachings is something that is a very distant goal, but rather this is fundamentally activating the state of Buddhism within your own life instantly at that point. When you stop chanting, though, you remain in the lower 9 worlds. And so you carry out your activities in life in these lower 9 states, hopefully moving higher towards the state of bodhisattva. And most people have an underlying fundamental tendency in their life, and this might be a state of rapture, if it was a person who tended to be happy. It could be a state of anger for some people. There could be many different fundamental tendencies. Animality for a person who tends to be really jealous and watching, from other people. And in a busy circumstance of environmental stimulation, we're affected and able to distract ourselves. But it's like when all things are gone and we're totally quiet, alone, what do we sort of settle back down into? Some people might be in the world of learning. Leave them alone, they won't go to a party, they'll go to a library and read a book. They have that as their fundamental tendency. So as we practice, the goal is to make Buddhahood the fundamental tendency within our own life. This is underlying all the things that are practiced within our Buddhism, and why I'm explaining this is that the process for dying or preparing for death or looking forward to your next lifetime is something that is exactly the same as how you're living every day. In other words, there's no special preparation for death, but rather every day you're activating this Buddha nature. Every day you're striving to elevate your actions in your daily life higher in the 9 worlds. Nichiren Daishonin talked about these 10 worlds, saying that if we, we hear about heaven and hell, but if we pause and think about it for a minute, we realize that heaven and hell don't exist somewhere else. They exist within our own life, within our own body. He also said that there are not 2 worlds, two lands, the pure land and the impure land, but rather it depends solely on the minds of the people. If the minds of the people are pure, so is their land. If the minds of the people are impure, so is their lands. There's not 2 different worlds. And so as people purify their life condition, as they polish the diamond, you might say the rough-cut diamond that they truly don't know about, but it exists within their own life, more and more they establish a diamond-like life condition that is not disturbed, is not overturned by the inevitable changes and problems and sufferings that we have to deal with in our life. As people do this, they have an influence on their environment and each other because there's no separation. Esho Funi is a principle of the oneness of a person and their environment. So there's a tremendous impact and change on environmental circumstances, social interactions, relationships among people in a family, or even the environmental issues of a community or of a country, dependent on the inner life condition of the person or the people of that land. We call that process also human revolution. That human revolution is an inner spiritual change, a revolution of character, you might say, that is the making of this Buddhahood as our fundamental nature. And this is, of course, paired with study and efforts to live an altruistic life, the life of the Bodhisattva. The Soka Gakkai organization gives many opportunities for people to encourage, help, serve, and offer service to other people in the form of a Bodhisattva. So it's able to give people a balanced practice. We call it Jigyo and Keta, practice for oneself and practice for others. So I've prattled on here, saying a lot about this, but I think this is an essential point I need to make and we need to understand about these 10 worlds and about this establishment of this fundamental life tendency of Buddhahood, because the degree to which we have accumulated good fortune and good karma through our actions in our life are going to be critical at the time of death. I'm going to try and keep this simple. This is a big subject, to talk about very briefly. But people, I think, are curious about, what happens when you die and the real mechanics of it all. And since we do have something to say about that, that's kind of more interesting, I guess, than some of the more philosophical points. But in the process of dying, I mentioned those birth, living, death, meaning dying process, and the intermediate state between death and rebirth. In the process of death or dying, the palm tree keeps coming up. I'll never forget the exploding palm tree, the firecracker palm tree that was mentioned earlier today. But life doesn't stop in an instant. It's like an oasis in a desert. It maybe is supplied by an underground spring or water, and so it's got a pond, it's got bushes around it, it's got a palm tree or two, and when the water begins to disappear or dries up, the oasis doesn't go, just vanish with it. The water maybe just turns to mud, and then maybe that's dry, but everything is still there. Gradually you see the certain weaker plants disappear. Maybe the grass goes quickly, the bushes slowly disappear, slowly the palm tree. It takes a process by which things go from an active state into the latent state. And our life is the same. As this process is going on, the condition of belief in the fact that our life is one with what we would refer to as the mystic law, the law of, I should explain. Mystic law, or myoho, is another name we might use for the Buddha or Buddhahood. The Buddhahood that you have in yourself, we would say, at the core of your life, at the 9th level of consciousness, you have this Buddha nature. But in another way, what we're actually saying is that's your life, that Buddha is life. This was one revelation or clarification that Josei Toda, the second president of the Soka Gakkai, had during a time when he was under great stress as a votary of the Lotus Sutra, being persecuted. He was imprisoned by the Japanese government for not accepting the Shinto faith during the war. And he was in prison starving, and recited the Lotus Sutra and read it over and over, chanted Daimoku and read the Lotus Sutra endlessly, trying to grasp its meaning of the part where it talks about the different negations, what the Buddha isn't. And he was contemplating this over and over, and it had a mystical revelation, but his conclusion was that the Buddha is life. And to me, when I studied that, or I first heard that, I said, well, that's sure, of course, but apparently that's not been that clear or that simple. And so it makes it much more simple to grasp that you have, the you kind of life, but if you want to go through 9 levels of consciousness, at the deepest level, there's this pure life force, you might say. And that is exactly the same in every person. And it's the same as the life of all things, or the life of the universe. So the life of the universe, this fundamental entity, we could say all phenomena are manifestations of the mystic law. We're all talking about life itself, or that push, the mystic drive or desire, whatever it is. And it's a compassionate desire, fortunately. So in this phase of dying, as this, your life is ebbing, how much you have been able to understand through your intuition and grasp and make a part of yourself that this fundamental entity that is at the core of your life is the same as the life of the universe itself, is very fundamental, because you begin to lose your ability to think, your senses of remembering, your willpower to say, I'm a good Buddhist, I really want to believe this, I'm ready to go. This works for a certain point, but at some point those cognitive abilities are gone, and you're dealing more with a feeling and intuition. And if you become very disturbed during this point, or begin to get scared or nervous, or have a grasping for to live longer, or these things, this could be a very disturbing influence. It reminded me of many of the other things that were described earlier today, and similar, trying to have a clear, calm awareness as you go through this process. Let me read you something here that Daisaku Ikeda wrote in Unlocking the Secrets of Life and Death. In the general turmoil of this process, it's natural that our experience should be very different from that of normal life. If we become frightened and confused because of all the unaccustomed sensations, allowing earthly desires and illusions to permeate our lives in a frantic struggle finally at the moment of death, all the efforts we may have made to elevate ourselves, if not based on the mystic law, may be nullified in a single instant. The way in which we face the moment of death determines whether or not we crown our lives with complete fulfillment. So, from the Buddhist perspective, our ability successfully to pass through the dying process depends on our steady efforts during life to accumulate good causes and to strengthen the foundation of goodness in the depths of our lives. And Nichiren Daishonin wrote about this, "Be resolved to summon forth the great power of your faith and chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo with the prayer that your faith will be steadfast and correct at the moment of your death." So even if we have still, maybe through our causes during our lifetime, our balance sheet of good karma, good causes doesn't outweigh our negative causes, then naturally, as is reported in a lot of near-death experiences and things like this, we are confronted with the reality of how we lived our life, and we're seeing it in a very clear mirror. As we see these good and bad come back, we seem to be able to, really reflect on them in a very accurate way and feel regret for the things that we've done that have hurt other people, and feel joy for the things that we've done that have really, contributed to the happiness or to the, good of other people. So naturally we want to have a balance sheet that's pretty strong in the good side. But what Nichiren Daishonin is teaching us also, that far more important even than that balance sheet is the extent to which we maintain unshakable faith in the mystic law. That this is really something that is going to carry us through. Okay. Some practical examples of how we deal with situations with death and dying. Every day in our prayers, we do a silent prayer, 5 in the morning, 3 at night, along with reciting a chapter and a half of the Lotus Sutra. One of those prayers is a memorial for the deceased. And in it we are offering, sending our Daimoku, which means Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, to the lives of those who have passed away, who are close to us or we have some contact with. And through this prayer, we're able to influence their lives. If a person is chanting during their lifetime, they certainly can influence their own life condition and have that fundamental tendency to see them through. As they are dying, family often gather around, friends gather around, we'll chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo with that person quietly or in another room. And when the person is unable to chant themselves, this Daimoku is able to also keep them on that track and have a wonderful effect for them. When the person has died and we weren't there, or even we're feeling concern or suffering the loss and concerned about this person, our prayers are able to touch them also. And Nichiren Daishonin explains this is because these prayers are coming from the state of Buddhahood in ourself as we chant this Daimoku, and the person is able to feel this in the level of consciousness that still remains with their life. The alaya consciousness is the level at which our karma is stored during our lifetime, and as a person passes away, one way of thinking of it is that the karma, the good and bad, and the various other aspects of that person's life are sort of stored as tiny seeds in this alaya consciousness. The person's life fuses back into the life of the universe, hopefully into, the life of the universe has 10 worlds as well, hopefully into the world of Buddhahood in the universe, but it could be into any of the other lesser worlds as well. When we continue to chant for this person's happiness, we're able to help them elevate their life condition into the state of Buddhahood. I know this is a very quick form of attaining enlightenment, if you're familiar with general Buddhist theory. Nichiren Daishonen's Buddhism is sometimes referred to in his writings as instantaneous enlightenment, because in the cosmic scale of time, to be able to attain Buddhahood in one lifetime is incredible. That's ridiculously quick, and it's almost instantaneous. But that is exactly what his teaching holds, and the reason being that the practice of chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo is such a direct, powerful, direct path to enlightenment. So our memorial services, when we have them, are actually just larger groups of people offering the same prayer, chanting the same sutra, the same daimoku, and the same prayer for the peaceful repose and enlightenment of the deceased. We may gather together in a large group and call it a funeral or a memorial service, but we actually are doing a memorial service or for everyone that we wish to pray for twice a day. A unique, I think, aspect of these services within the SGI is that they're invariably joyful events. The funerals that I've been to, both in Christian faiths and in Buddhist religions for friends or colleagues, have been very somber events. And I remember one of the leaders who taught me a lot about Buddhism when I first joined died of cancer years ago, and many of those early people who had gone and lived in other areas, we hadn't seen each other in a long time, there, like 250 people gathered for this memorial service at one of our community centers. And the prayer, the chanting of Daimoku was so strong and vigorous. His wife was there, his children were there, and they asked anybody that wanted to come up and say a few words. People got up and just couldn't say enough about how this man had touched their lives, what had really been the way that he had given them something. And it was laughter and joy, and the whole consciousness of people is, if we are in a joyful state, in other words, we're showing the actual proof of our own life condition from chanting. His wife too was able to, through her prayer, go from a feeling of sadness to a feeling of it's okay, and having a very real sense of not being separated from him in a true sense, but having that closeness that they had still. She could feel that. And as she continued to chant, she began to feel, again, appreciation and joy and hope. We're able to continuously regenerate hope from despair through the personal practice. And when you get 200 people together who've done that, there's a great deal of appreciation and joy and happiness, and feel this is felt by the person. If we look at the near-death experiences, there seem to be lots of awareness, whether a person's just died or even after that they're feeling the sorrow of people in the room, or they're feeling the joy. And when they can feel great happiness and joy, this is something that we can share with them. When we feel sadness and despair and loss, this is what we're sending to them. And this is what they're feeling that they've left behind. And a parent may feel terrible having left a family behind after they died, and if all they are getting is tears and sorrow from the feelings of the family, this doesn't help their life condition at all. So we have a very optimistic attitude towards our own faith and practice, and feel that this is really guaranteeing the enlightenment of the deceased. Am I out of time? I think I am. I had some experiences also of SGI members who are in the health professions and who are helping families who are not Buddhist, but rather are, through their own view of life, able to encourage these people, many of whom, regardless of their background, most of them being Christian, don't seem to have any particular guidelines on how to cope with death in the family. One was a nurse named Teresa Haber back in New Jersey, and she went to this one home. She said, I've got her story here, found this Mrs. L who had died, wanted to die at home, and was there in bed in a coma, not responding to word or touch. Her color was ashen, her extremities blue and cold, her breathing had become labored. When she arrived, the room was dimly lit. In it stood her husband, son, and 2 daughters. All were weepy. I thought how fortunate this 86-year-old woman is. She's in a familiar environment, physically comfortable, surrounded by an obviously caring family. I thought what great effort she must have made to establish value in creating these meaningful relationships. How much effort she must have exerted to instruct her now adult children on the significance of family and harmonious bonds, and how hard it must be for her now to hear them weep without any recourse. Hearing is one of the last senses to go, and if a person is in that state, they're very sensitive to what's going on around them, the crying or the sadness, versus, confidence. In our case, it would be the, chanting of Daimoku would be so reassuring to that person, yet sometimes we don't realize they're able to hear that. The family approached me asking, "What can we do? What can we do?" Calmly I said, "Why are the lights out? Why are you crying? Doesn't death come to us all? How fortunate your mother is to be here with all of you." I told the family that hearing is our last sense to leave, and even though their mother couldn't respond, I was confident she was aware of her surroundings. I asked them, please, to the best of their ability, make this a positive experience. I suggested that they hold warm conversations with one another, remembering all the good times they had together and how wonderful life had been and how much they appreciated her. I promised to make the patient comfortable, and then I left. About 1 a.m. my beeper sounded and Mrs. L had passed away. The family requested that I come back out to their home. I arrived at the home, and much to my surprise, all eyes were dry, the lights were on, everyone was smiling, and I was greeted with a big hug. I entered the patient's room, and sure enough, no breathing could be heard nor a pulse felt. Yet Mrs. L appeared so comfortable. Her cheeks were pink, and she had a smile on her face. I also found that her limbs were supple enough, even though it had taken me over an hour and a half to get there after her death. An obvious physical transformation had taken place from when I had been there some hours before. To me, it verified that this person's life was at peace. I congratulated the family and said how wonderful their mother must have been. A few days later, I received a call from Mrs. L's late husband to thank me. He told me that what I had done was beyond medicine and that I will never forget it as long as I live, he said. So I think we can see that the Buddhist, view of death is something that can help people regardless of whether they practice or not. And in many cases, we have families where one member is practicing this Buddhism, but the rest of the family is not. And someone in the family is dying or has died. The one SGI member goes there with a sense of confidence, with a sense of they're not freaked out. They have a inner strength. And they've gotten that through the many times they've gotten evidence that their chanting works, solving smaller problems in their daily life over and over and over. So death is just another big problem. But with this view and with the inner strength, they were able to give the gift of confidence to many other people. And in simple ways, just taking care of business and reassuring people, become the pillar of the family in those instances. And many times we hear similar stories to this coming back. So in conclusion, I'd like to read one other statement that Daisaku Ikeda made in that speech at Harvard that is really addressing the issue of death and dying, the points that Buddhism has to offer, and the need for this in our country and our society today. He said, "Humankind seems finally to be on the verge of realizing the fundamental error of our view of life and death. To understand that death is more than the absence of life, that death, together with active life, is necessary to the formation of a larger, more essential whole. The greater whole to which I refer is the deeper continuity of life and death which we experience as individuals and which we express as culture. A central and fundamental challenge for the coming century will be that of establishing a culture based on an understanding of life and death and of life's essential eternity, that does not disown death, but directly confronts and correctly positions death within a larger living context." So thank you very much.
Is that okay? No. Let's really thank JerryHall. We'll have an opportunity to ask Jerry questions after the next speaker when we have our panel up, okay? Let's see. The topic of really our conferences have been living and dying. We did talk about some living aspects, okay? But our next speaker today is CharleyBenn, who received his PhD in Chinese history from the University of Michigan and specialized in the history of Taoism. He has published articles on Taoist ideology of the 8th century Chinese emperor, which I can't pronounce his name, and a book on the Taoist ordination ritual of 2 Chinese princesses entitled The Cavern Mystery Transmission, a Taoist ordination rite of AD 711. And Dr. Ben has taught at the University of Arizona, the University of Toronto, and the University of Hawaii. Also, Dr. Ben is one of the world's leading authorities on Chinese Taoism, but he has many other interests. And currently, he is working on such diverse topics as the history of food and banquets in China, and Chinese painting of woodblock illustrations, and he collects Chinese ghost stories, which has been his longtime interest. And today, Dr. Ben will be sharing with us some Chinese ghost stories. So let's welcome Dr. CharleyBenn.
There was a man named Sun Jun-cho, who was an infidel when it came to the ghosts. He not only did not believe in them, but he defamed them and denigrated them. And one day he was walking down a country road on his way home, and he spied a grave by the side of the road that had been destroyed by the wind and rain. All that remained was the skeleton. So he walked off the road, went to the corpse, pulled down his pants, bent over the corpse, and defecated into the skull, saying, "Eat this, isn't it delicious?" To which the skull replied, "Yes, it is." Needless to say, Sun jumped up, pulled his pants up, and ran down the road with the skull rolling along behind him. He reached a bridge, and Chinese bridges are very humpbacked like this, and he was able to escape the skull because the skull couldn't roll up and over the bridge. When he got home, he fell ill and went to bed, and in his delirium he would reach down, grab his excrement, bear it to his mouth, and eat it, saying, "Eat this, isn't it delicious?" It sounds like a rather disgusting story, but it is Chinese, when I say. There is a certain point to this story, and that point is that the body does not lose its vitality after death in Chinese thought. The bone retains a soul, as it were, in Chinese thought. This soul is called the Po soul, and it is part of the human body. It's at birth. All bodies are endowed with this vital principle, and this principle represents the animal part of mankind. That is, its emotional state, its biological functions, and so forth. So when you were born, or not when you were born, when you were conceived, your Po came into existence. And it stayed vital until your death, and may even persist after death. It will persist as long as there's flesh on the bone, and sometimes in the bones itself, as we've just seen. Which, of course, leads to what? Vampires. Because vampires are what? Vampires are, and both in China and the West, the living dead. That is, people who have, I don't want to call them live after death. What do I want? They remain animated after death. That is to say, that whatever principle was keeping them going in life remained after death, but they don't retain their reason. Vampires are not reasonable creatures. I don't think even in the West a vampire is a reasonable creature. And there are plenty of stories in Chinese literature about vampires. I don't need to go into any of them more. What I will do next is quote you 2 or 3 principles from a text that dates from 316 AD, and they come from a section of the text called the Joseph on prescriptions for saving the dead. If one has died from nightmares, you can revive him by biting his big toe or spitting in his face. If he is drowned, pour vinegar into his nose and stuff lime wrapped in cotton up his rectum. In cases of sudden death, waft the fumes of burning sheep dung in his nostrils, and he will revive. What occurs to you to be ironic about what you've just heard? What's the title of this section? No, the section I just quoted from. Prescriptions for saving the dead. Why does that occur to you to be bizarre? When was the last time you tried to save the dead? This is nothing, of course, but first aid as far as the Chinese were concerned. And first aid is concerned with what? Saving the living. There is an important distinction here which you should not lose, and that distinction is that as far as the Chinese were concerned, those who were stricken with nightmares and could not be easily awakened were dead. Those who had drowned but whose functions had not ceased were dead. That's a different conception of death, a radically different conception of death from modern terms. In our sense of death, we have measured death, A, as an absence of breathing, B, as an absence of blood circulation, and C, as an absence of brain waves. In all 3 cases, the Western notion of death, there's one earlier one, by the way, the absence of movement, which is the most primitive of all, but that falls more or less into the Chinese conception of death. In our modern conception, death is the total cessation of biological, physiological functions. Not so in the Chinese conception of death. Chinese have in traditional times, of course, we're talking about China now as China, not China as its westernized equivalent, which is often called modern China. There is no such thing as modern China. It is westernized China. Some of the things I may say are a bit controversial. You may wish to disagree with them, and you're quite free to do so. But what China is now today, especially in urban areas, is really nothing but a sort of bad carbon copy of the United States or Western Europe. The music is no longer Chinese. It's a kind of denigrated form of Western rock and roll and that sort of thing. Well, that's beside the point. At any rate, in traditional China, death was a very broad phenomenon, and best defined as the loss of consciousness. The loss of consciousness. People who are in comas, people who are in trances, people who are ill, and you can't wake up easily, are dead, as far as the Chinese is concerned. The definition in Chinese, however, is somewhat different. They would explain it in traditional times as the loss of your Hun soul. And the Hun soul is slightly different, or was radically different from the Po soul. It is not attached to the flesh. And it may roam in life, and it certainly does in death, away from the body. It exists only in incipient form at birth and begins to develop only about the age of 6 or 7. 6 or 7 is the age of what? School. So now we can have we can develop some sort of notion of what the Hun soul is. It is that part of us that is educatable, which, of course, in Western language would be our reason. And it begins to develop about the age of 6 or 7, and then becomes stronger and stronger the more you are educated and the more you mature, until it reaches a kind of maturity about the age of 20. It is this part of the soul which is saved, this part of the soul that passes on into whatever life exists beyond the tomb, and it is this which we call also the ghost in many instances. There was a certain Liubo one who possessed the capacity to send his soul out from his body. And he lived in a monastery. And one time he sent his soul out, we're not told for precisely what purpose, and while his soul was away from his body, a government official came to the monastery and wanted a room. The monastery was full, and he happened upon this room where the body of this Liu Bo one was lying. Finding that he was not breathing and there were no signs of life, the official had him cremated. Subsequently, the next day, the soul returned and wanted to go back into its body, but its body was gone. And it banged on the window. A friend opened the window, the soul flew in and occupied the friend's body, increasing its intelligence. See, this one soul can depart and roam about the world of men as well as transport itself into whatever afterlife exists. There was a criminal whom the authorities had caught on 3 different occasions and beaten to death. And they threw his body in the river. But each time he would revive and come back and commit more crimes. On the last occasion, however, he made the mistake of beating his mother. You see, before he would commit his crimes, he would take his one soul out of his body and put it in a jar. So all that was needed was for them to recover his body, and they would open the jar, and his soul would go back into the body. Well, his mother was very mad at him for beating her, so she went and told the magistrate who broke the jar. So the next time he came back, he was executed, and his soul no longer roamed in the world of men. There is, in traditional China, and even today in peasant China, at least outside of the People's Republic, when I talk about traditional China in modern times, I'm generally referring to peasant society in Taiwan or in Hong Kong, or even among the non-educated classes of certain cities. Urbanized life has pretty much destroyed traditional culture. But there is, in this traditional culture, a thin line between the notion of life and death. A very thin line. The Chinese have never adopted this sort of Christian notion, or I guess Buddhist notion, that death is the end, that another existence begins after that. For the Chinese, what happens after death is pretty much the same as what happened before death. A person is not different after his death. Death is a kind of just a short jump of some sort. It's minor transition. It is not a great break in the status or the needs of the dead. They persist after death, and one should, of course, any of you who are Chinese or who know about Chinese is certainly aware of this by the central function of ancestor worship, which is to provide what? Food. Another aspect of Chinese culture of ultimate importance is the importance of food. There is no other culture which is so preoccupied by and so expert at as China in terms of food, in the preparation and in the enjoyment of food. And I don't accept the French either in this case. Food is, it is difficult to explain in terms of Chinese culture, but it is one of those things around which the whole culture gravitates. Language is formulated by concepts of food. 你吃饱了, have you eaten to your fill does not mean have you eaten to your fill. It is the same equivalent as how are you?
You've reached your greatest love.
What, you're cutting me off now?
No, keep close to the mic.
Oh,
for the film,
it doesn't go-
for the video.
I have to wander. I'm a roaming ghost here. What do you... Of course, all ritual sacrifices, there are 3 important elements. Oh, is this a roving? This is a roving mic. Just right for ghosts. From the beginning, there were 3 central sacrifices: a chicken, a fish, and a pig's head. I've never quite figured out why the rest of the pig was excluded. That it is traditional. You will find that in all kinds of Chinese woodblock prints, whatever they're going to sacrifice. And brew.
The term jiu, which I translate as brew, is usually translated as wine. It is not wine. The Chinese never had wine until it was introduced, when the grape was introduced. They had rice brew. It is not beer, but it's made the same way as beer, and therefore we call it brew, because we don't have any adequate term for it. And of course, Chinese culture was very much oriented to brew. Brew all of the time. Central to the sacrifice, if those of you who are interested in this question want to know more about it, please read the Truths, the Songs of the South, in which the shaman goes out and communicates with the spirit of dead, and he talks to him. He says, he enumerates all of the great dishes that this guy is missing by wandering around out there and not coming home. And it is one of the most important documents in terms of Chinese culture, because it tells us what they were eating then. And it's a precise description of all of the great and fantastic dishes this poor sucker is missing by not coming back to his ancestral sacrifice. In 1970, a tomb was discovered south of Changsha at a place called Maondui, and there was a woman perfectly preserved in it. Well, our interest is the fact that around her were all of these delicate dishes placed in the tomb. Pheasant, deer, all kinds of food were put in the tomb as to provide her with her final meal when she went off into the next life. The food is not consumed by the ghost, by the spirit. Only the odor, the wafting odor of the tongue. And this is an important distinction, because what does the family do after the sacrifice? They eat the food. This is perhaps the basic, most elemental notion of sharing between the living and the dead. And this tremendously important notion to the Chinese of this intimacy between the deceased and his descendants. If one were to characterize the Chinese attitude in traditional times, their attitude towards the dead, it would have to be this: they believe in an intimate relationship. Not that they really want the dead around. No, no. You do not want the dead around. Only for a short period. Only for a short period do you want them. You do not want them drifting around your house. My mother-in-law bought a house in Honolulu, which on one side overlooks one graveyard, and on the other side overlooks another graveyard. She is terrified to death to stay in that house alone. You see, ghosts can travel in straight lines, and she has no trees between her and the cemeteries. So she is deathly afraid of staying in that house by herself. Nevertheless, the notion of sharing provides, on brief occasions, the anniversary of the deceased birthday, Qingming, in the spring, about April 4th, I believe, somewhere around there, when food is shared. And food sharing in all cultures is an important, extremely important bonding, to use that terrible word, overused, hackneyed word, bonding between people. All cultures have a sense of hospitality, and that hospitality has to do with sharing food. And the Chinese, of course, have made it this tremendous religious concept. All words in Chinese that have to do with religion, aside from Buddhism and some of the other more elaborate forms of religion, have a radical which stands for offering table. And that radical tells you what religion was for the Chinese: offering food and consuming the food thereof. Food was not the only appetite the dead continued to maintain. They also wanted sex. There was a drowned man in the 15th century whose soul came back to meet his wife in their bedchamber. She was terrified to death, so she insisted on her maid staying with her. He came back 2 weeks in a row, every night, every night for 2 weeks. And finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. He says, "How can I make love to you when you have your servants in my bedroom?" And then she got the idea, so she dismissed him. And for a year thereafter, they enjoyed conjugal relations until he became tired of going back and forth between the two worlds, so he took her with him into the next life. Well, I told you. Chinese religion is fascinating, isn't it? And then, of course, there were couples that didn't always get along too well together. There was a general who had gone off onto an expedition in the northern border, leaving his wife alone. She died. No, pardon me, I'm sorry, I got the story. His wife died and he went off to the border. And she got lonely, so her ghost came out of the tomb and went to the local governor's office, where she seduced the local governor. And he had relations with this ghost for some time. We're not told exactly how long. She presented him with a silver chalice from her coffin, and he presented her with a number of bolts of silk. The general returned and was visiting the governor in his office and spied the silver chalice he had left in his wife's coffin. Oh. He was much upset by this. The governor explained the circumstances to him. The general went home, opened his wife's coffin, and discovered the bolts of silk there. So, to get even, he burned her coffin and body. And once you burn them, they're gone. The soul's, at least the poor soul, is gone. There are, of course, any number of marriages. China's, I don't know to what degree this is practiced in other cultures, but China's probably unique in one sense in providing post-mortem marriages. This is particularly true for infants, male infants who die. It is felt that they deserve a wife in the next life. So a post-mortem marriage is carried out with a recently deceased young lady, not necessarily an infant. And they will go through the whole process. A matchmaker will be called and paid, of course, for her services to match the two couples together. Divination will be performed to determine whether they're compatible. Wedding clothing will be sewn, and a wedding ceremony will be carried out at the grave, at which point the two bodies will be buried together. And you have, a kind of post-mortem marriage for people who are going to live their married life in the afterlife. Economic. If you go down to Chinatown today and you go into any of the small stores, you will find them selling what? For funerals. Paper money. It used to be real gold. And up to about 220 BC, they used to put real gold. We've recovered a lot of gold out of tombs for that reason. And then later on, they put in copper cash, and then that got to be too expensive, so they invented fake paper money, which is most often labeled Hell's banknotes. And you go down and buy 50 or 60 million for about 10 or 20 bucks, right? And this money then is burned. And why is it burned? Why do you burn it? Why don't you bury it in the coffin? You're getting close. Odor is a very important religious concept in Chinese religion, by the way. It's matter. The horn is not connected with matter, with the body. You have to transform whatever you're going to send to it into its spiritual essence, and therefore you burn the money. The money is then transformed into ethereal money, which is usable in hell. Because either in this lifetime or the last time, that poor soul has incurred debts. He incurred those debts to bribe off the officials in hell to shorten his term or to ease his torture. And when he gets back there, his debtors want him to pay it back. So you burn money so that he can pay off his debts to his creditors back there in hell. All kinds of things, of course, have been offered for the dead. Dead need servants and soldiers. In the early times, back in the Shang Dynasty, Much to the consternation of modern Chinese, it was discovered that they used to dispatch human beings in the tombs, chopping their heads off, so presumably so they couldn't wander away, on horses and chariots and all the rest. Later, this custom, of course, died and was replaced by pottery figurines, not pottery, clay figurines. The most famous of these are Qinshi Huangdi's army of soldiers, which have recently been dug up near Xi'an in central China. In later times, the same notion of burning came into being, and as a consequence, these figures were made of paper, and they were burned at funerals. This still goes on today. In fact, a funeral is a means of providing everything that the ghost needs in the next life. Originally, he needed transportation through hell, so they provided sedan chairs. Nowadays, this has been modernized, and they're effigies of Cadillacs. In the Han Dynasty, they also thought about providing for the entertainment of the dead, and they used to put in clay figures of acrobats and musicians so that the deceased would enjoy music and entertainment in the afterlife. Nowadays, they put in effigies of televisions. Anything to provide for the needs of the dead. Tombs were modeled after earthly palaces. They had bedrooms, parlors, and one I know of even had a privy. How thoughtful. Provide for every need. I'm going to cut this, I'm already running a little over, so I'm going to cut this a little short. There are two poles to this. What the dead need, which is provided by the living, and what the living need, which is provided by the dead. There is a story from the Tang Dynasty of a young child who came down with heart pains. A ghost appeared to inform the family that it needed tiger's testicles to cure this disease. And if the family would lend him a lance, he would provide the same. They gave him the lance, he went off, came back with the lance and threw the tiger's testicles on the ground before them. Presumably the child was cured thereafter. Fertility. The ancestors, the dead, provided fertility of the soil. The Tape3, one of the most famous classics of the Han Dynasty, tells us that people should be especially careful in their ancestor worship, because if they did not, the soil would lose its fertility and crops would die. The ancestors says that the dead provide for the welfare of the living. In bronze inscriptions, there are 4 requests prior to the year 600 BC. 4 requests are made over and over again. Good fortune, happiness, emolument, and long life. Good fortune means money and land. Happiness, essentially marriage and children. What was the third one? Emolument, an official position with a good salary. And long life, longevity. If you go to a jewelry store in Chinatown today and you look at their gold jewelry, you'll find the same 4 characters. The same 4 characters used as a kind of talisman. And you, of course, provide them at certain ages. You don't, for example, provide a young man with the character Shou for a long life. That's presumed. You wait, and if a person has already passed his career, you don't provide him with this Lu, the character for emolument. This brings us down to one of the most important concepts, one of the most important functions, and one of the most important religious concepts in Chinese religion, and that is the notion of justice. Justice was often denied the living. The Chinese judicial system was anything but just. It was often arbitrary and capricious. And therefore, as a kind of, I guess, a psychological compensation, the Chinese developed a strong notion that justice would be exacted in the afterlife. I'll give you two examples. There was a guy by the name of Xu Mai who was a Taoist, and he was intent upon acquiring physical immortality, becoming a celestial immortal. And he had applied to the Master of Destiny, who lives under Mount Tai in Shandong province, and the Master of Destiny was about to grant his request. However, 47 individuals appeared at his court beneath Mount Tai and lodged suits against him. And their plaint was, you cannot grant this man immortality because his uncle killed 47 people. His uncle killed 47 people. And they went through and they listed every individual. Every individual presented his complaint, how he had been killed, and how unjust this was. And poor old Xu Mai was sweating as this trial, see, he's participating in this trial. This is going on. He's having a vision of this going on. And so after the prosecution, as it were, has presented this request, and the bailiffs are about to carry him off to prison, and he would have been skinned if he had been carried out to prison, he presented his defense. And he went back to an earlier relative, 7 generations previously, who had been a governor of a prefecture in which a famine had occurred. And the governor had spent his own money and saved the lives of 408 people. So the judgment was in Xu Mai's favor. It's a simple mathematical thing. You take 47, you subtract it from 408, and you come out with 361. He's got 361 lives to his credit. Unfortunately, the lawsuit besmirched his reputation, and he was only allowed to become a terrestrial immortal, not a celestial immortal. But he was not denied the possibility of further advancement to becoming a celestial immortal by further self-cultivation. And then there's the case of his relative, Xu Mi, who also had an ancestor who had killed, in this case, 4 people. And as a result, these souls of these 4 people had come to register a complaint before the magistrates of the underworld. And as a consequence, Xu Mi's wife had been arrested and was imprisoned in her tomb before she had been released from her tomb into the afterlife. And but as a consequence of his ancestor's sin, she was now re-imprisoned in her tomb. And so Xu Mi asks the perfected how he can go about erasing this sin from his past as saving his wife. And the answer was, well, you have to go into her tomb and do certain things. And they will give 4 gifts. A certain amount of gold, a certain amount of paper, a certain amount of rice, a certain amount of something else, which I've just forgotten. As a consequence, her soul was released, and she went back to the paradise underneath the mountain. There is, of course, a moral in this lesson, that is, bribery pays. The Chinese culture is the oldest, staunchest, and most thorough bureaucratic culture in the world. And when they created their afterlife, they created it as an exact model of the imperial government. And everybody knew that all those bureaucrats were corrupt. And consequently, corruption was built into the system of afterlife. It was built in. The squeeze was automatic. It was no longer bribery anymore. It became sort of a fee. Right? In a given circumstance. If you don't believe this, paper money, for example, has become so routinized that the amount you burn at a person's funeral is determined by his birth date. And it may range from 32,000 to 300,000, depending upon what day of the year you're born. So justice was something that was because it was not readily available in the secular world, was something that was ultimately satisfied in the afterlife. There's, of course, way over here, the case of Empress Gao, who who lived in the early Han Dynasty. And she wanted her son on the throne, so she murdered her rival and had his mother's arms and legs cut off and her eyeballs gouged out, and threw the remains, which looked something like a pig in her vision, into a privy. Some years later, a blue dog appeared before her, jumped up and grabbed her in the kidneys, and she subsequently died. The blue dog, of course, immediately disappeared, as the ghost come back to take its revenge. Vengeance and the ghosts is a very prominent feature of all Chinese ghost stories. I don't want us to suggest by these desultory remarks that this is true. Somebody said, are these stories true? True is, truth like beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. These are stories, but they do indeed reflect beliefs or fears the Chinese always had about the dead and about dying. All of them exemplify certain kinds of characteristics. One of them is there is no discontinuity between life and death and the living and the dead. Much of this results from the notion, the basic social notion of the Chinese, that kinship is everything. And a relative who has died is not severed from the lineage and is not an absent member from the family. He continues on. He is worshipped, or he is provided for 5 to 7 generations. Why 5 to 7? Because that's probably the length of memory furthest back. What generation was the oldest ancestor you can remember? Mine is 5 exactly, 5 generations, that I personally can remember. It was 5 generations back. Or I should say, there's 5 generations between him and my sons. There will be 6 generations, I guess, when my sons have kids. And I might get around to 7 generations if I live long enough for their kids to have kids. Memory is everything in terms of the relationship of the Chinese to their ghosts. Once you cease to remember them, they're dead. There are certain exceptions to this rule. Li Bai, one of the 2 most famous poets in Chinese history, was a drunk. He loved his brew more than others. And according to mythology, he got drunk one night and was looking down at his reflection, narcissistically looking at his reflection in the river, fell in and drowned. But he had established his immortality because he wrote poetry better than anyone. And as a consequence, he was made the god of a star. What star? Anybody remember? The star Brew. He is the god of wine. His memory will not perish, even in secular culture, because the myth of it goes on. But his father and his brothers and his sons, nobody remembers. In fact, I don't think we even know who his father was. So the ancestor dies when the memory dies. And plus, in addition, it became exceedingly complicated to have more than 7 generations in your ritual cycle. I mean, the meals get getting bigger, bigger. For those of you who are interested in this phenomenon, there's a Buddhist temple down on Tenrikyo. What street is that on? No, the cross street. Jack Lane, somewhere around. It's not Jack Lane, but it's one of those streets. And it's a Buddhist temple, but ironically, it has a big room, a big building at the back, in which people put up their ancestral tablet, the tablets for their ancestors. You see, the ancestral tablet was that piece of wood in which the man's name was engraved, into which the spirit passed during the sacrifices. It was the temporary seat of the soul during the sacrifices. Now, these are all erected in nice little rows, gold widgets, in nice little rows going up like this, all the way to the ceiling. And I mean, there must be thousands of them.
The one we call place.
Yeah.
Shuyin Temple.
Shuyin Temple. I couldn't remember the name. And you can go there and see the ancestral tablets. on anniversary days, people, the descendants come there and pay a basis. They don't offer food this far. Oh yes, they offer burnt paper money, but they don't offer food. Do they? They burn paper money and televisions and stuff. And then food. Okay. At any rate, it is an extraordinarily important notion for all of Chinese culture that none of this is seen as particulars. They are all interrelated. The Chinese cosmology of traditional times was a kind of circle into which everything fit. There was no sense of, especially in the Western sense, of dichotomizing things into polarities, like Hegel did. Hegel, of course, happened upon the notion of dialectics, but he got it all wrong. See, he kept thinking things all have to go out here opposite and conflict and then come back together. The Chinese just said, well, it's like a big soup bowl with your yin and yang symbol in it. Sometimes the black part is stronger than the white, and sometimes the white part is stronger than the black, but it never conflicts. It never goes out of the circle. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. I think I talked 2.5 times. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer at this point.
I'm going to bring everybody back, the three of you, and answer questions. Is that okay?
Questions? I was just here to get my dribble. I didn't know I was
Let's thank Dr. Penn. Can we now call Dr. Becker and JerryHall back to the stage, and we're going to have a panel discussion. They may give remarks, and you may ask questions, okay? You want this back?
By the way, this has nothing to do with Buddhism. I'm not even sure why I was invited here.
For entertainment.
Well, I was always prone to verbal diarrhea, as my wife said.
I feel like we should have guitars here or something. These script blanks. Hello.
Are the mics okay?
We're singing. Doesn't it look like a treat?
Our speakers, if they would like to say a few remarks about the other topics, or they can take questions. So if Dr. Becker would like to say.
I got a number of questions over lunch and between sessions from people about, isn't Buddhism pessimistic? And the Buddhist answer, because Buddhism talks about everything being suffering. Life, birth is suffering, life is suffering, sickness is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering. To say everything is suffering or unsatisfactory isn't pessimistic. And there's a whole literature about that. But to make a very brief response, since so many people have asked about it, the Buddhist would say, no, that's realistic. It would be pessimistic if you said there were nothing you could do about suffering. But Buddhism gives you a response to suffering. And by controlling your thought pattern and lifestyle, you can reduce that suffering and ultimately escape from it. So it's not pessimistic in that sense. Now, is aging, sickness, and death unrealistic? I can't guarantee you that you'll get young again, but I can guarantee you, if you're lucky enough, that you'll get old. I can't guarantee you that you'll be healthy, but I can guarantee you get sick. I can't guarantee you live long, but I can guarantee you will die. The Buddhist would say, this is realistic, not pessimistic. Now, you say, I'm young, I'm healthy, I have my girlfriend and my car, and I live in Hawaii, what more could I want? How can you be pessimistic about that? And I'd say, because you're blind. You're using that car is destroying resources. You're destroying fuel that will never be back in this world. The pleasure that you consume will never be available for someone else, even if that energy were to be used for life-saving, valuable reasons, or to develop medicine, for example. You're just going to burn it. And you can only enjoy that because you're blind to the consequences of your pleasure seeking. And the same for your car and your light. Everything we consume is something that no one else can ever consume. Our simply existing physically on this world means that we take in clean air and blow out carbon dioxide. We take in clean water and give out polluted water. We kill things, plants, and some people kill animals, and some people indirectly kill people in order to get what they want, and we defecate. Now, if we're not aware of that cycle, we could say, oh, everything's fine, I'm cool, I got my girlfriend, my car, I'm living in my... But if you become aware of that, there's a heavy suffering in destroying life. There's a heavy suffering in polluting. There's a heavy suffering in not being able to give back to the world what we have polluted and dirtied and destroyed in our lifetime. And that's not exaggerating. That's just a different realization, a different cut on what it's all about. So, my answer to the question from a Buddhist perspective is, life is suffering. And that's not pessimistic because there are things we can do about it. There are ways we can reduce the amount of suffering. Ways we can reduce our consumption and our pollution. But that's the way it is.
Nobody asked me any questions at lunch. But I'd like to say a few words about suffering also, because Buddhism does look at this as refers to it as the Saha world of suffering, and a lot of Buddhist thought is how to get out of here and go somewhere else. And Nichiren's Buddhism also talks about the suffering.
It's a ghost.
The wandering ghost has a mic now.
Sangha and the devotees, the vast majority of Chinese never accepted the notion of life as suffering. And that's why you see all of this concern for providing for the dead. The dead have to have their televisions. Even the gods, in temples in Taiwan, God is sitting there at the end of the temple, and right opposite him they put up a TV so he can see all his offerings in which his life is portrayed. I'm quite serious about this. And the TV is always tuned to that station that has the local opera about that particular deity. I'm not putting Buddhism down here. I'm just trying to see a contrast between what I said and what everybody else said. The same is also particularly true of Taoism. Taoism is not based on this notion of life as suffering. Life in the afterlife is the same as life in this. There's no discontinuity, no distinction between the way we live now and the way we will live in the afterlife, except that it's eternal. So says the ghost.
Any questions?
I have a question for Dr. Becker. You had spoken something to do with, I can't think of this, I'm sorry, I speak rather loud. In your reference to your near-death experiences in the afterlife, you made references to the visions that people see, and it sounded like from what you said that the visions are cognitive manifestations of the ideas and emotions of the person who experiences them. Would you say that was correct?
No.
Okay, could you elaborate on that, explain it?
First of all, what do you mean by cognitive manifestations of what?
The cognitive manifestations of the ideas and the emotions that the person is projecting into the visions that they see.
Okay, there are Marxists and atheists and people who have never been inside a religious building who have seen somebody they are sure was Jesus in a near-death experience. Now, you might argue, but they were raised in a culture that had that image somewhere, or they wouldn't have been able to identify him as Jesus. Yes, maybe, but it was not their expectation. It was not their cognitive thing that did it to them. If you saw my presentation last night, young Nobori met a person who was later identifiable as his great-grandfather, when he neither had the expectation of meeting his great-grandfather, nor knew that it was his great-grandfather when he encountered him, until he later was able to trace that through face and speech and other things, height. Another case. There was a lady devotee of Greek Orthodox faith. And in Greek Orthodox faith, people pray through icons to God the Father, because God the Father is so remote that he cannot be prayed to directly in some sense. And she prayed morning and night to this beautiful icon. It was like a poster of Paul Newman. I mean, a gorgeous man with jeweled, whatever they call those hats that the Pope wears, and a jeweled crook, and a jeweled white robe, and no human, much less woman, could look at that poster without swooning. It was, I mean, I saw a picture of the icon. It was a beautiful icon. And she prayed to this figure for many, many years, and as she got into her 80s, she was hospitalized, and she had a near-death experience. And during the near-death experience, she went through the tunnel and arrived in this land where a bearded, shaggy, barefoot, smelly, hulking German said, "You already? Guess I'm going to show you around." And he guided her around, and as she was guiding her around this next realm of experience, she got the strong impression that maybe this was St. Hieronymus, whom she'd been praying to. And when she came back and told this near-death experience to her grandchildren, they looked for the first time in the encyclopedia, who is Hieronymus anyway? And it turns out he was a German monk and ascetic who walked around barefoot, pilgriming to all these temples, and they didn't have photographs in those days, but the sketch of what he looked like corresponded remarkably to the grubby, bearded figure she had met in this experience. So, in a sense, yes, she wanted to be saved by St. Hieronymus, but the person she wanted to be saved by looked a whole lot more like Paul Newman in his better days. And here she was being saved by somebody who corresponded to a saint who died 600 years ago. Now that doesn't look like it's completely generated out of expectation. There are a bunch of studies going on in American hospitals now about near-death experiences of the blind. And most people who are long-term terminal in hospital situations at elderly age are female. And most females in their 90s have declining vision. And if they were 39 instead of 89, we do various operations to fix up their eyes, but at 89 there are too many other complications, so they're just left with vision, which is very poor. There are many people like that. They can just barely distinguish light and shadow. Can't even see, clearly people. But in their near-death experience, a number of these people have reported drifting out of their bodies and being able to read the warning, "Do not open except for qualified service personnel" message, which is written in letters you have to have a magnifying glass to read, on the back of the TV set in the corner of their room. Flying all over the room and reading the get well card from their grandson and seeing how he wrote the second L backward, the second J backwards. And things they have no way of knowing without very good vision. And then, after that experience, getting back into their bodies. And those kinds of experiences seem to demonstrate this is not just a projection of expectation, or however you worded it. Is that helpful?
No, that isn't how I worded it. Maybe I just said it unclearly. I understood what you were saying at lunchtime today to us in class, that the visions that people have as they go, so when they go through a near-death experience, to be projections of ideas, their own ideas.
I didn't say their own ideas.
Okay, well then could you explain what you
Yep.
mean by that?
Let me say we superimpose on a world that is out there our own filter, our own construction of that world. Based on the vocabulary we bring to it, the experience we bring to it, the expectations we bring to it. I don't think we ought to continue this too much longer because other people may have valuable things to say. But what I was trying to say at lunchtime, and I'm sorry you weren't all there, was that the real experience or the real ideational existence after this physical realm, we color very heavily with our projections and impositions. But that doesn't mean it's totally self-generated. Is that acceptable?
That sounds more like what you said on now.
Okay.
Can we get other questions, the other speakers?
Mr. Hall, I was really interested when you said I am American, and this has a little connection to Professor Aronson's talk on Western appropriations. I was wondering whether you, as a white American belonging to the SGI, do you find any Western imposition onto the traditions of the SGI?
Western, do I find any Western what?
You know, values being imposed on the SGI and maybe upsetting the balance a little bit? You understand?
I couldn't.
You can't understand what I
Did you
mean.
find any imposition of Western values on the SGI?
Imposition of Western values on SGI.
Onto your SGI.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that's been going on for 30 years is the Buddhism has come along, and how do we strip all the Japanese culture off of it and get the Buddhism part and apply it in an American context? I think this is going to be my life's work. I think it will take my whole life to see this. Because what Carl said was very true. This is very Japanese Buddhism. The words, the interpretation, the examples given, many things are within a Japanese cultural context. And so when I began to practice this Buddhism in 1967, the group that I joined was all American young people in Santa Monica, California, some of whom fancied themselves ex-hippies, and some were college students. And so they had, in a sense, the essence of this practice, but were starting to do it, in a vernacular. The explanations, everything was beginning to be from an American point of view. But it's been a very gradual process. So I would say that there are definitely Western ideas are influencing it. I think Buddhism has done that every country and every culture it's ever gone into. Sometimes it can absorb existing culture and embrace it and use it as a means of explanation itself. If it's a universal truth, then it should work anywhere, and there should be examples within every society and every culture to explain the principles of Buddhism. So in that sense, I think we're having an impact that's probably, being felt back to some extent by the Gakkai in Japan. And again, it's a huge international experiment. 117 countries, including Japan, have people practicing this Buddhism. And one of the mottos of the SGI is that your goal is to become an outstanding citizen of your country and be able to establish a happy family and happy life and contribute to that society. So it has to be within the context of the values of that society. But at the depth of almost every human culture, there are certain common values that Buddhism does address. Did I get anywhere near what you were asking?
We'll do one last question before we close.
Just last week, we in my Japanese history class, we learned about Nichiren, and we were taught that he preached the superiority of Japanese culture, and that the writers still tattoo Namo Myoho Renge Kyo on their chests. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Who's tattooing them?
Japanese rightists who are believers in the Nichiren sect.
Okay. Nichiren did not preach the superiority of Japanese or Japanese culture at all. In his writings, there are many very derogatory comments about the limitations of the Japanese society, about the emperor, of the small island kingdom. And in many ways, his vision was far beyond that. But he was very, strong and is referred to as militant, mainly because of his very adamant stance to try to save people of his time from suffering, which he blamed to an extent on the faiths of the day not doing the job. So he was critical, and in some, got the animosity of quite a few people at that time. As time has come, down through the ages, right-wing or ultra-nationalistic Japanese groups have embraced Nichiren and found some of his writings, I believe, very much out of context to support their views of very nationalistic stances. But I think that a real, thorough study of Nichiren's writings will find that he's supporting allegiance to no race, no country. His Buddhism is transcending that very much, but the rightist groups have often used his name, and maybe there's so many sects of Nichiren Buddhism and other writings, but certainly the approach that we have to it, and we feel the actual intention of Nichiren was nothing like that.
We'd like to thank our speakers for participating in the final panel, CharleyBenn, JerryHall, and Carl Becker. Let's give them a great hand. Thank you.
Thank you all.
To formally close our program, I'd like to call Dr. David Chappell to say some closing words. Thank you.
We've had quite an afternoon, a good way to end. We began with an angel, we end with a hungry ghost. We certainly have explored some of the breadth and depth of this topic. I think our closing panel especially, Jerry mentioned that his creative work will involve seeking what is universal to find a way of expressing that in a new culture in America. Well, that tension, that search is ongoing. Carl has mentioned also that stories that show us from the near-death and death experience that there are many things that are real that exceed what our mind understands. And Jerry is struggling with that to implement that in creating a new and new cultural values that can unify the world. And Charley, as our hungry ghost, our wandering ghost, demonstrates that mystery.
That's all you can say, huh?
Filled with vitality, which defies any clear conceptualization or control. So I must say, this whole experience for me, so many people have been involved, so many people have been helpful and volunteered and assisted. That's been a miracle for me, how this has all worked out. I see sets. For the second session, she calls it the Sangha coming together, the group coming together. It's just, so this has been, for me anyway, and I'm sure for all of you, a wonderful experience of warm-hearted and clear-headed people coming together, enjoying the mystery of life, to try to support each other through those difficult times. So thank you, and thank S.G. Allen.
I think we all owe a head of gratitude to David Chappell, who's really poured himself into this.